The courtroom hummed with tension, a murmur of low whispers rippling through the crowd as a tall man with deep brown skin and a sharp, tailored suit stepped into the spotlight. His hands were bound with steel shackles, but his composure radiated strength. Across the aisle, the arresting officer leaned back smugly, arms crossed, confident he would see the man crumble. Yet, as the judge flipped through the case file, the officer's smirk faltered. Unease spread across his face, his earlier confidence replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The crowd held its collective breath, struck by the mystery of the man standing before them. Earlier that morning, Daniel Hayes started his day in a quiet, sunlit neighborhood where life moved at a leisurely pace. Neighbors exchanged polite nods, but rarely stopped for conversation. A man in his late 40s, Daniel carried himself with a calm, assured demeanor. His sharp mind and compassionate spirit were his trademarks. With a briefcase in hand, he left his modest home before sunrise, heading for the city courthouse. As he passed a corner bus stop, Daniel noticed an older woman struggling to lift her grocery bags onto the bench. Without a second thought, he placed his briefcase down and stepped in to help, carefully placing the heavy bags beside her. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. Her weathered face softened with relief as her burden was lifted. Daniel gave a small, warm smile, the kind that spoke of quiet kindness rather than empty platitudes. He turned to leave, his mind already on the day ahead. But a police cruiser cruising slowly down the street caught his eye. At first, Daniel paid no attention. It was a common enough sight. Yet the car slowed to an unsettling crawl, and the officer behind the wheel fixed him with a hard, probing stare. Daniel adjusted his tie, maintaining his composure, but an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. The cruiser screeched to a halt. The officer, a burly man in his early 30s with a permanent scowl etched on his face, stepped out, his hand resting on his belt. "Hey, you! Hold it right there," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the morning. Pedestrians nearby glanced over nervously but quickly hurried along, unwilling to get involved. Daniel froze for a moment, then turned to face the officer, his calm mask concealing the rush of frustration and disbelief within. The officer approached with deliberate aggression, demanding to see Daniel's identification. Though taken aback, Daniel handed over his ID, his movements slow and deliberate, refusing to show fear. But the officer's tone grew sharper. He began hurling baseless accusations: loitering, suspicious behavior, possible theft. Daniel's stomach churned, but he knew better than to argue. "This is absurd," Daniel thought, his pulse quickening. "I was just helping someone." The elderly woman stepped forward to vouch for him, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. But the officer cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Step aside, ma'am. This doesn't concern you," he snapped. Daniel clenched his jaw, a mix of anger and humiliation coursing through him. A small crowd began to form, watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Before Daniel could respond, the officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. The handcuffs clicked into place, their cold metal biting into his skin. Daniel's mind raced. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, shoved into the back of a police car like a common criminal. Hours later, Daniel sat in a stark holding cell, his wrists aching from the cuffs. The arresting officer lingered nearby, making snide remarks about entitled types who thought they were above the law. Daniel remained silent, though each word stung. His briefcase, unceremoniously dumped on a desk, lay open, its carefully arranged papers scattered haphazardly. The officer's smug demeanor grated on Daniel's nerves, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew this was more than a misunderstanding. It was a pointed display of power. The booking process dragged on, each question dripping with judgment. Whispers floated around the station, speculations about who Daniel might be, wild theories about money laundering or fraud. None of it mattered. Daniel's focus remained on the truth. That night, he was told he'd appear before a judge in the morning. The officer grinned, as though anticipating a personal victory. Daniel, however, felt no such fear. He knew the truth would emerge soon enough. The next morning, Daniel entered the packed courtroom. Shackled and flanked by guards, he was led to the defendant's table. Gasps rippled through the room as people took in the sight of the dignified man in cuffs. The officer watched from the side, his smugness returning. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, called the court to order. As the case was read, the charges seemed flimsy at best. But it wasn't until the judge asked for Daniel's name and role that the real shockwave hit. "This is Daniel Hayes," she said, her voice carrying weight. The newly appointed district attorney. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The officer's face turned ghostly pale. His confidence crumbled as the reality of his actions set in. Evidence was presented, eyewitness accounts, security footage, all of which exonerated Daniel. The judge, visibly angered by the officer's conduct, ordered an immediate investigation into his behavior. As the shackles were removed, Daniel stood tall, his dignity unshaken. He walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. Outside, a small crowd gathered, murmuring about the injustice they had just witnessed. Daniel paused, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a stand against prejudice, a reminder that justice could prevail, even against the odds. With quiet determination, Daniel moved forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Daniel stepped into the crisp morning air outside the courthouse, the tension that had gripped him since his unjust arrest began to ebb. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of awe, anger, and solidarity. For some, his story was a stark reminder of the systemic bias woven into everyday life. For others, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to how truth and dignity could rise above humiliation and injustice. Daniel paused for a moment, letting the sunlight warm his face. He could have spoken out then, letting his frustration explode in fiery words aimed at the officer and the broken system that allowed such behavior. But instead, he chose a different path. His journey had never been about anger. It had always been about justice, fairness, and the unwavering belief in the power of doing what was right. His silence spoke louder than any speech he could have delivered. The officer, who had once strutted with confidence, now stood awkwardly at the courthouse steps, visibly diminished under the weight of his actions. For Daniel, there was no satisfaction in seeing him reduced to fear and regret. Instead, his focus turned toward the larger fight, a fight that demanded change not just for himself, but for every person wronged by prejudice and power imbalances. Reporters began to approach, cameras flashing and microphones extended, eager to capture his thoughts. Daniel met their questions with calm but firm resolve. "This isn't about one man or one mistake," he said, his voice steady yet resolute. "It's about creating a world where no one feels the sting of discrimination, where justice isn't a privilege, but a promise fulfilled for all." His words reverberated, carrying weight not just for the crowd gathered there, but for everyone who would read or hear them in the days to come. Daniel understood that the ripples of this moment could extend far beyond the courthouse walls.